The summer of 1945 arrived in the Lake District with the kind of perfect weather that made England's mountains almost inviting. Clear skies, gentle warmth, valleys green and endless. The war in Europe had been over for 2 months. And at Camp 18 near Windermere, about 200 German POWs were settling into what everyone assumed would be months of boring routine before repatriation. Farm work, road repair, the kind of labor that kept prisoners occupied without giving them anything interesting to do. But on July 12, 1945, 4 German prisoners did something that British guards had explicitly forbidden. They climbed Scafell Pike, England's highest mountain. And when the guards finally tracked them down at the summit, they found the Germans doing something so unexpected, so impossible to explain within normal POW behavior, and that the incident would be classified for over 30 years. The guards expected escape attempt, or sabotage, or some kind of German defiance. What they found instead was 4 POWs building a cairn, a memorial stone pile, dedicated to British climbers who died in the war. On England's highest peak, while technically escaped prisoners, honoring the enemy who defeated them. If you want to understand how war's end creates moral complexity that simple victory-defeat narratives can't handle, make sure you subscribe, because this story about German POWs climbing a British mountain to build a memorial reveals how human gestures can transcend politics and why some acts of respect become more dangerous to acknowledge than acts of defiance. Let me take you back to summer 1945. Germany has surrendered. The Reich is destroyed. Millions of German soldiers are in POW camps across Europe and Britain, waiting to be processed, waiting to go home to a Germany that no longer exists in the form they knew. The camps in Britain hold about 400,000 German POWs by mid-1945, mostly Wehrmacht soldiers captured in France and Germany during the final campaigns, plus some who'd been prisoners since earlier in the war. Camp 18, near Windermere, in the Lake District, holds about 200 Germans. It's a work camp. Prisoners do agricultural labor, forestry, infrastructure repair. The work is hard, but not brutal. Conditions follow Geneva Convention standards. Food is adequate. Medical care is available. By POW camp standards, especially compared to camps in the Soviet Union, it's relatively humane, but it's still prison. The prisoners are surrounded by barbed wire, guarded by British soldiers, forbidden from leaving camp without escort, restricted in their movements and activities. They're not mistreated, but they're not free. And psychologically, the situation is complex. These are men who spent years fighting for Germany, who believed in the cause to varying degrees, who are now defeated and captive in enemy territory. Some are relieved the war is over and they survived. Others are bitter about defeat. Many are just exhausted, processing trauma, waiting to find out what happened to their families in a devastated Germany. Among the 200 prisoners at Camp 18 are 4 men who, before the war, were mountaineers. Serious climbers. Men who'd spent their youth in the Bavarian Alps, who knew rock and ice and altitude, who understood mountains not as obstacles but as spaces of freedom and challenge. Like their names, Heinz Lorenz, Kurt Sievert, Rudolf Eisenschmidt, and Hans Godeke. They're in their 20s and 30s. They've been POWs for months, doing farm work and road repair, living in barracks, following rules. And they can see Scafell Pike from the camp, England's highest mountain. 978 meters, not high by alpine standards, but significant enough. And it's right there, visible, calling to them the way mountains call to people who understand them. The British camp commandant has standing orders. Prisoners are not to climb local mountains. The reason isn't security. The war is over. Escape to where? Germany is occupied. There's no Nazi government to return to. Attempting to flee across Britain would be pointless. The restriction exists because the British authorities don't want incidents. They don't want prisoners getting injured on mountains and requiring rescue. They don't want the optics of German POWs climbing British peaks while British soldiers are still dying in the Pacific campaign against Japan. They don't want complications. So the rule is simple: no mountain climbing. But Lorenz and his 3 companions are climbers. And climbers, when they see mountains, have a hard time not climbing them. So they plan. Not an escape, an ascent. They'll climb Scafell Pike, spend a few hours at the summit, and return to camp before they're missed during the evening roll call. It's technically against orders. It's technically escape, even though they plan to come back. But they're not thinking in terms of military discipline or POW protocols. Say they're thinking like mountaineers who've been denied mountains for years and who finally have the opportunity to climb again. July 12, 1945. Morning work detail. The 4 Germans are assigned to forestry work in a wooded area a few miles from camp. The guards are relaxed. It's summer 1945. The war in Europe is over. These prisoners aren't considered dangerous. The supervision is loose enough that when Lawrence and his companions quietly slip away from the work site, it takes the guards nearly an hour to notice they're missing. By the time the alarm is raised, the 4 Germans are already miles away, approaching Scafell Pike. They move fast. They're fit from months of hard labor, and they know mountains. The ascent isn't technically difficult. Scafell Pike is a hiker's mountain. Not a climber's mountain by alpine standards, but it's not trivial either. The terrain is rough, the weather can change quickly, navigation requires attention. They reach the summit around midday, and there, at the highest point in England, they stop. Because this isn't just about climbing. This is about something else. Before the war, Lawrence had climbed in Britain. He'd been part of a German-British climbing exchange in the late 1930s, when mountaineers from both countries would visit each other's ranges, share techniques, build relationships through their shared passion for mountains. He'd met British climbers, had corresponded with them, had planned future climbs together. And then the war came, and those British climbers, some of them, had died. Not in the mountains, but in combat. Fighting against Germany, against men like Lawrence. The moral weight of this is complicated. Lawrence and his companions aren't pacifists. They fought for Germany. They did their duty as soldiers. But they're also mountaineers, and in the mountaineering community, national boundaries matter less than shared understanding of mountains. The British climbers who died weren't just enemies. They were fellow mountaineers who happened to be on the wrong side of a political conflict neither side had started. And Lawrence feels the weight of that. The sense that these deaths, these specific deaths of people who understood mountains, deserve acknowledgement. So at the summit of Scafell Pike, the 4 Germans build a cairn. A memorial pile of stones, carefully stacked, stable, and deliberate. It's a climbing tradition. Cairns mark summits, mark routes, mark places of significance. This cairn marks something else: respect for British climbers killed in the war. They don't have a plaque or inscription. They just build the pile of stones, arrange them carefully, and stand there for a moment acknowledging what it represents. It's not political. It's not strategic. It's just 4 German soldiers, technically escaped POWs, honoring British climbers who died in a war that both sides participated in and that nobody at that level wanted. And that's when the British guards find them. Because the camp authorities, once they realized 4 prisoners were missing, immediately began a search. And anyone with knowledge of the local area knew exactly where escaped German climbers would go: Scafell Pike. The guards reach the summit about an hour after the Germans. They expect confrontation. They're prepared for resistance or defiance or escape attempt. What they find instead is 4 Germans standing next to a cairn, clearly having made no attempt to flee, clearly having climbed the mountain for its own sake. The senior British guard, a sergeant named Thomas Whitfield, according to records, approaches carefully. He has a rifle. The Germans are unarmed. The situation could go badly very quickly. But Whitfield looks at the Germans, looks at the cairn, and asks, "What is this?" Lawrence, in his broken English, explains, "Memorial, for British climbers, killed in war. We knew some. They were good men, good climbers." The moment is documented in Whitfield's report, which remained classified until 1978. His description: the prisoners had constructed a memorial cairn. When questioned, they stated it was to honor British mountaineers killed during the war. The prisoners showed no sign of intending escape or resistance. They cooperated fully with return to camp. The incident presents unusual complications regarding appropriate disciplinary response. The complications are real. Technically, the Germans committed serious violations: leaving work detail without authorization, escaping from POW supervision, climbing mountains against explicit orders. Standard military discipline would require punishment. possibly solitary confinement, definitely loss of privileges, potentially transfer to higher security facilities. But the nature of what they did, building a memorial to British war dead on British soil while German POWs, creates moral and political complexity that the camp authorities aren't equipped to handle. If they punish the Germans harshly, they're punishing prisoners for honoring British soldiers. If they publicize what happened, they create a narrative that complicates the clean victory story. German soldiers showing respect for British dead in ways that suggest the enemy weren't simply evil, but were human beings who shared some values with their opponents. If they ignore it, they're failing to enforce camp discipline and potentially encouraging other prisoners to break rules. The solution is bureaucratic containment. The 4 Germans are returned to camp. They're given 2 weeks of additional work duty, a punishment that's real but not severe. The incident is documented but classified. The cairn on Scafell Pike is left standing but not acknowledged in official records, and the guards are instructed not to discuss what happened. The whole event is treated as an anomaly that doesn't fit into standard categories and is therefore best handled by minimizing attention to it. But the cairn remains. Through 1945 through 1946, as German POWs are gradually repatriated and Camp 18 is eventually closed. British climbers ascending Scafell Pike occasionally encounter this pile of stones that looks deliberately constructed but has no marking, no inscription, no explanation. Some assume it's a navigation cairn. Others think it's a summit marker built by hikers. A few who know the local area's history wonder if it might be connected to the German POW camp, but there's no official confirmation. The story only emerges in the late 1970s when British military records from the immediate post-war period are declassified. Researchers going through POW camp files find Whitfield's report, find the documentation of the incident, and reconstruct what happened. By that point, Lawrence and 2 of his companions are still alive in Germany. They're interviewed by British mountaineering historians. Lawrence, by then in his 60s, describes the climb and the memorial. "We were not making political statement. We were not trying to escape. We were climbers who had been denied mountains for years. And when we finally could climb again, we wanted to acknowledge the British climbers who had died. They would have understood. Climbers understand mountains transcend politics." The British climbing community's response is complex. Some appreciate the gesture, the recognition that mountaineering creates bonds that war interrupts but doesn't fully destroy. And others are uncomfortable with the idea that German soldiers, even German POWs showing respect, should be commemorated or honored in British climbing history. The debate continues for years, resurfacing occasionally when articles about the incident appear in climbing journals or local Lake District histories. The deeper significance isn't just about 4 Germans building a cairn. It's about what happens when the categories of war, enemy/ally, victor/defeated, good/evil, encounter the messy reality of individual humans making gestures of respect that don't fit into those categories. The British authorities in 1945 couldn't acknowledge the cairn publicly because doing so would require explaining that German POWs had honored British war dead, which implied that Germans were capable of respect and honor toward their enemies, which complicated the narrative of total German villainy that justified the war and the peace. But ignoring it entirely felt wrong to the guards who encountered it, to Whitfield who documented it, to the camp authorities who chose minimal punishment rather than harsh discipline. So they compromised. They contained it, classified it, let it exist without acknowledging its existence. It's a very British solution to moral complexity. Allow the thing to be real, but don't talk about it. Let time and bureaucracy absorb the contradiction without requiring anyone to take a clear position. Today there's a plaque on Scafell Pike mentioning the German POW cairn, though it was added decades after the original stones were placed. The plaque is vague about details, cautious about interpretation. It acknowledges that German POWs built a memorial but doesn't specify to whom or why, leaving the full story for those who seek it out in archives and historical accounts. The original cairn from 1945 has been rebuilt and modified so many times by subsequent climbers that it's impossible to know which stones, if any, are from Lawrence's original construction. The 4 German climbers returned to Germany in late 1945 and early 1946. Lawrence became a climbing instructor in Bavaria, continued mountaineering into his 70s. Sievert and Eisenschmidt resumed civilian lives, occasionally climbed for recreation. Godeke died in the 1950s in a climbing accident in the Alps. None of them returned to Britain, though Lorenz corresponded occasionally with British climbers who'd learned his story. And when Lorenz was interviewed in the 1970s about why they did it, his answer was simple. We were prisoners, yes, but we were also climbers. And climbers honor climbers. The war put us on opposite sides, but mountains don't have sides. At summits, there are no borders, no enemies, just humans who understand what it means to climb. That's what the cairn was about. The British Sergeant Whitfield, who found them at the summit, was also interviewed decades later. He'd kept quiet about the incident for 30 years, following the classification orders. But once the records were declassified, he was willing to talk. I expected trouble when we found them. Escaped prisoners on a mountain. Anything could happen. But when I saw what they'd built, when they explained it was for British climbers killed in the war, it changed the situation. They weren't enemies at that moment. They were just men showing respect. I reported it accurately, knowing it would create complications, but it seemed important not to lie about what they'd actually done. The story of German POWs climbing Scafell Pike to build a memorial for British climbers is one of those historical moments that resists simple interpretation. It's not a story of heroism or villainy. It's not clearly about reconciliation or defiance. It's about four men who were soldiers and prisoners and climbers, who made a choice that violated camp rules but expressed something about shared human values that transcended the political and military categories that had defined their lives for years. And it's about how institutions, in this case, the British POW camp system, responded to that kind of gesture by containing it, classifying it, letting it exist in limbo rather than forcing it into a narrative that didn't quite fit. The cairn on Scafell Pike stands today as a reminder that war creates categories: enemy, ally, victor, defeated. But humans keep making gestures that don't fit those categories, that express respect and connection across lines that politics and violence have drawn. And sometimes the most honest response to those gestures isn't celebration or condemnation, but the quiet acknowledgement that they happened, that they meant something, and that their meaning is complicated enough to deserve more than simplistic interpretation. The German climbers who built it understood that. The British Guard who found it understood that. And the bureaucrats who classified the incident for decades might have understood it too. That some truths are too complex to fit into the clean narratives that victory requires.